Welcome to our Australian Fulbright Alumni Association event and our interview with Ahmad Shuja Jamal, who is a Fulbright alumnus, a National Committee member, and an accomplished author and scholar. So we have the privilege today to delve into Shuja's personal experience behind his book, Decline and Fall of the Republic of Afghanistan, the book that he co-authored with William Maley. My name is Angela Heise, and I'm the Vice President of AFAA, and I'll be starting the conversation, and then we are going to be all joining in with our own questions for those of us who are online. So who's Ahmad Shuja Jamal? With an educational background in political science, public policy, and international relations, Shuja brings a wealth of expertise to his research and writing. His professional experience extends to academia, having written numerous publications, including serving as editor-in-chief for the Georgetown Public Policy Review. He has also lent his insights as a consultant and advisor to organizations involved in refugee support and conflict resolution, further amplifying his practical understanding of political and military happenings. During the events explored in Decline and Fall of the Republic of Afghanistan, Shuja served first as Director for Peace and Civilian Protection, and then as Director General for International Relations and Regional Cooperation for the Afghan Office of the National Security Council in Kabul. As an active participant in the historical events that took place in Afghanistan when the Taliban took power in 2021, Shuja's first-hand experiences and insights equip him with a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter he explores in his book. Over the next hour, we will hear about the part that is not included in this meticulously researched and documented book that unravels the intricacies of historical events, his personal experiences. Welcome, Shuja. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Angela.
So your LinkedIn profile states that you left your position with the Afghan National Security Council in August 2021. And that sounds perfectly okay until you combine it with the fact that the Taliban entered the capital, Kabul, on August 2015, 2021. So there's an evacuation that took place during that time that extracted 124,334 people on 778 flights. And I can only imagine what that would have been like. So how was that for you? I mean, we're starting at the end, but.
Yes, absolutely. I woke up that morning on August 15, 2021. I put on my suit, I took my briefcase, and I put my trusty Samsung cell phone in my pocket, and I drove to work, thinking that it would be another day at work. My office was at the Presidential Palace at the Office of the National Security Council. So basically, here was the building with the president's office. Right next to it was the building with the National Security Council office, and that's where I worked. And it was very, very obvious from the very beginning. I arrived at work just about at 8:30 a.m. It was very evident that there was something different that morning in the air at the Presidential Palace. And you could feel the tentativeness, the skittishness. I think people had a sense of sort of suspended animation as to anything could happen at any moment. There was a sense of fear. And so by 11 a.m. that morning, it was very clear that panic was beginning to set in, even in the Presidential Protection Service, the PPS, which guards not just the president, but also the Presidential Palace. So the PPS was in full panic mode. The city itself by 11 a.m. was in full panic mode. At 11 a.m., I went into a private clinic where I was sort of doing a COVID test. In the 30 minutes it took me to get out of that clinic, the city was changed. The traffic was chock-a-block. You couldn't move an inch because everybody had heard that the Taliban were entering the city. Others had heard rumors that the Taliban had taken over a certain police station. Others had heard that the Taliban are beginning to round people up. And so in that panic, if you were a shopkeeper, you were closing shop to go home. If you were a civil servant, you were closing and leaving your office to go home. And everybody was trying to go somewhere. And in that process, The city was in full panic mode. I tried to get back to the presidential palace and try to get back to my work, but between the clinic and the presidential palace was the headquarters of a major bank. And you could see that people were lining up not just around the block, but bunching up at the entrance of this compound of the bank. And because of that overcrowding of people rushing on the bank, and because of the traffic, I just could not move an inch in the direction of my office, and I decided to go home. It took me about 2 hours to go roughly 2/3 of the 15-kilometer distance between where I was and where my home was. And I concluded that it was going to be impossible for me to get home. So I turned around and I asked myself, where would you go now? And the only place that seemed logical to me was the Kabul airport, because from previous experience, we had seen in the media, but also in the National Security Council, that when the rest of a city falls, the security forces congregate in the airport, which gives them a degree of air mobility. And so they protect the airport because that's the way in which you could bring food, reinforcements, supplies into the city. So I thought I will go to the airport in Kabul because that would be a well-defended place to go to. And by the time I got to the airport, it was very clear that even the security around the airport was beginning to fray. I will stop there and we can take it from there.
Okay. All right. So you were at the airport, and what happened before? Because I mean, from what I gather from your book, this is, and as you said, this was very unexpected, right? But it wasn't really, because there were so many things that happened before then. I mean, all the provinces around Kabul were falling, but there was so much chaos. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because that's really important to explain why things happened so quickly.
So for a very, very long time, the Taliban were unable to capture even a single provincial capital. But in late July, early August, one of the Western provincial capitals fell to the Taliban. And that was really sort of a domino that set into motion a number of other precipitating falls of provincial capitals. And the more provincial capitals fell, the faster the rate of the fall started for other provincial capitals, because the morale just fell, because some of the provincial capitals were home to military corps. And so the corps had helicopters, they had fighter jets, they had personnel, they had equipment, and they had ammunition. So as soon as those corps fell to the Taliban, the Afghan National Army weakened significantly, and the Taliban gained significant strength. And so that really created a cascade in which the fall of other provinces subsequently became all that much faster. But as the provinces around Kabul and around the country were falling, the US Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the American point person in negotiating with the Taliban, but also the point person with the Afghan government on issues of negotiation with the Taliban, had extracted promises from the Taliban political leadership who were in Doha, where they maintained an office out of which they were negotiating with the US, that Taliban foot soldiers would not militarily enter Kabul city. Mm. The rationale for this promise by the Taliban not to enter militarily into Kabul city was to give the Afghan government enough time to muster a broadly representative political delegation that would travel to Doha and negotiate some form of face-saving political power transfer. And the power transfer could be about, we will give you the power in Kabul over formally, in exchange for which you would give, for example, amnesty for Afghan security forces. You would enable women to continue to participate in public life. But before even the delegation had the chance to leave Kabul that morning on the 15th of August, the Taliban entered the city despite their promises to the US. And so what you saw at that moment was that a promise by the Taliban that was not kept by the foot soldiers in Kabul And the American point person who was engaging with the Taliban in Doha was unreachable by the Afghan government. He had been unreachable since April. And so when push came to shove and Kabul was this close to falling, the American representative was nowhere to be found by the Afghan government. The Taliban in Doha were either unwilling or incapable of stopping these foot soldiers who were smelling blood and just itching to enter Kabul. And they started entering Kabul. And so that gives you a sense that in those final hours and final days, nobody was really fully in charge of what was happening in and around Kabul, because each country or each player, the Taliban, the US, and Afghanistan, was in charge of one segment of them. And there was a total communication breakdown between two of the main players here, which is the Afghan government and Ambassador Khalilzad, the US Special Representative.
Could I ask, why did that initial province fall, which started the whole cascade of other provinces going down? Was there a particular reason? What was it? Poorly defended?
I think you'll see that in any conflict that stretches over nearly 20 years, that the Taliban had gained enough strength by the 20th year that they could actually take the battle to not just one place, but multiple locations across the country. And what that does is it stretches the capacity of the defending forces to do a number of things. Number one, to send reinforcing troops. Number two, to supply ammunition and food in places where the defenders need it. Number three, to evacuate the wounded. And number four, to maintain enough political will among the defenders to continue to defend. And so when the fight starts to erupt, not in one place, not in two places, not in 5 places, but in 34 provinces, maintaining all of those levels of activity that I just talked about, reconnaissance, logistics, political will, becomes impossible. Simultaneously, all the time, every day. And so one of those places is bound to fall. And we have seen in the past that, provinces did fall on a number of occasions, but the Afghan National Security Forces were able to swiftly come back, take over, and drive the Taliban out. But by now, because morale in the security forces had suffered significantly, political morale in the country had suffered significantly because of the US Taliban deal in Doha, which happened behind the backs of the Afghan government, which was not included in those conversations, even though a number of key decisions were taken that affected directly the interests of the Afghan people, that led to a fall in morale. And so we in the book argue that what happened in Afghanistan in July and August of 2021 was really a cascade that was set off by a trigger. And we identify that trigger as the signing and implementation of the US Taliban deal. So the framework of our analysis is that there are factors that contribute to the decline of countries, and countries can often remain in decline over decades, over generations. But sometimes in some places, it takes a trigger to trigger a number of cascades that result in the fall of that country. And in this book, we argue that problems of legitimacy, problems of economic dependence for aid and budget, problems of constitutional design, problems of political divisions plagued Afghanistan, and those problems were real. They were important. There were failures of leadership. Those were real and important. There were failures of governance. Those were real and important. But these problems, to a certain degree, exist everywhere: in Australia, in Pakistan, in Iran, in Tajikistan, and they often are important, but they're not always fatal. What's fatal is an external shock into that system, which then hits deep into the vulnerabilities that trigger the collapse of that system. And And so in our view, the cascades that resulted from the trigger was the US Taliban deal.
Which was signed on September 30, 2020, right?
Which was signed on the 20th of February 2020, or in February 2020.
In Doha, it's the Doha agreement, right?
In Doha.
Okay. So it didn't take any time at all, really, to dismantle the whole government. And from what I understand is from your book is that there were all sorts of the underlying factors, and I don't want you to, there's no way you can summarize a 280-page book, in one sentence. But there were several aspects that were really important, and one of them was the undermining of trust, as you mentioned. And that was, and I was wondering, how was that for you? Because on one hand, and that was including the trust in the US, obviously, because once they signed an agreement with the Taliban, but you were the editor-in-chief for the Georgetown, for Georgetown
Public Policy Review.
Public Policy Review, and on the other hand, you were part of the Security Council. So how you saw both perspectives. So how did that work for you? I mean, what conclusions did you come to as with regards to what you were dealing with every day?
I think you will see that when the Americans appointed Ambassador Khalilzad early in the Trump administration in 2016, just after 2016, I think he was appointed in September 2018 or thereabouts. My historic knowledge on this needs to be double checked, but his efforts in getting to sit at the same table with the Taliban and speak about peace were a breakthrough. Because the Taliban in the past 20 years, despite everybody's best efforts, had not sat at a table speaking earnestly about a process that could result in a political settlement of the 20-year war. And so there was a level of cautious optimism, and dare I say, a level of hope among the people in Afghanistan, but also among the people in the Afghan government, that this could be the breakthrough that really changes the dynamics of the war, which was increasingly costly, increasingly costing human lives, and increasingly making it impossible for the Afghan government to govern in more parts of the country every day. And so there was cautious optimism to begin with, but I think you began to see early red flags. One of the big red flags was that Ambassador Khalilzad decided to negotiate with the Taliban to the exclusion of the Afghan government. And not just that, but the Ambassador Khalilzad was negotiating and agreeing on things that also affected the interests of the countries that had answered the American call to come to Afghanistan in October of 2021. That includes a lot of NATO member states, but also non-NATO member states like Australia, who was in Afghanistan. So some of the things that Ambassador Khalilzad decided to the exclusion of everybody was that Australian soldiers, NATO soldiers, US soldiers, everybody would leave Afghanistan within 14 months of the signing of this deal, without consulting or letting know Australia or NATO member countries that this was happening. And so here was a diplomat who was negotiating to the exclusion of not just the country whose interests are directly affected, but also countries who had invested treasure and blood and money for 20 years in Afghanistan. And so when that happened, it changed the dynamics both domestically for the Afghan government, but also with its international partners, the US, Australia, the EU countries, but also regional countries in Afghanistan's neighborhood. Domestically, what it sent, the message it sent was that the Afghan government was no longer the only game in town with respect to the Taliban. That sure, they have an army that's fighting the Taliban, but the real conversations are happening in Doha between the US and the Taliban, not the Afghan government. And so that had implications on the morale of the troops who had been fighting and dying and defending the country. It had implications on politics, because politicians were now beginning to hedge their bets, establishing contacts with the Taliban, being just that much differential to Taliban, and being just that much wishy-washy on protecting the constitution, being just that much unsure about whether the presidential elections in 2019 were to go ahead. So domestically, the political environment changed, the military environment changed, but also the economic environment changed, because anybody who could afford anything and had amassed any level of wealth, they were taking it out of Afghanistan. That process had started a few years ago, but people are now beginning to panic because negotiations to the exclusion of the Afghan government meant that the Taliban were coming back, whether you like it or not. The international partners like Australia, the US, and the EU countries were now anticipating that the talks would result in some form of Taliban presence in Afghanistan, either as the main governing party or one party among a coalition that would share power in Afghanistan. And so if you were going to sign a strategic partnership agreement with the Afghan government, you were going to delay that because the Taliban coming into power would change all of those dynamics anyway. And we knew this because we had a number of strategic partnership agreements up for renewal, including with Norway, which was not renewing it with us because they were very cautious. It also meant that if you were going to make decisions about multi-year development assistance and budget assistance, you were going to only make that commitment for 1 year or for 6 months. Because if the Taliban came next year and they decided to ban women's education, then you, being a good law-abiding country, would not subsidize that country, subsidize Afghanistan, which is engaging in egregious gender policies. So everybody started hedging their bets in military assistance and strategic partnership in development assistance. So Afghanistan's partners began to be tentative as well. In the neighborhood, countries also saw the direction of the winds changing. And so countries like Central Asian countries, Turkmenistan, China to the east of Afghanistan started welcoming Taliban delegations. In Turkmenistan, for example, the foreign minister actually went to the airport on the tarmac and received the delegation from the Taliban. There are countries whose delegations go to Turkmenistan and the foreign minister does not show up. Here is a delegation from a UN-sanctioned organization actively seeking to overthrow a neighbor of Turkmenistan. But Turkmenistan is receiving their delegation at the highest level possible. And so it changed the dynamic in the region for Afghanistan as well. And so these are part of the cascades, the internal dynamics, politics, economy, and the morale of the soldiers, international partnerships, development assistance, strategic partnership agreements, but also regional countries beginning to shift their dynamics in ways that completely undermined the Afghan government.
So you have a whole section in your book that deals with betrayal. So this must have cut really deeply for you, because I mean, I love how you go from, you've got all the philosophers in there. You really go way beyond the context of Afghanistan. You bring a unique perspectives into this. So, but there's one that I read that really resonated with me, that I thought that was the one that you might resonate with, and I'm happy for you to totally disagree with me. Allies can betray one another in various ways: by abandoning a shared purpose, by withdrawing crucial resources, or by acting unilaterally behind the back of an alliance partner on a matter in which it has vital concern. Betrayal may be triggered by a sense that previously shared interests, ideology, or values are no longer important, but it can also be a product of domestic pressure, erratic leadership, or sheer bloody-mindedness. So
I think you've really put your finger, Angela, on a very key paragraph. On betrayal, that final epilogue, we talk about sort of what betrayal really means, and we sort of break it down to a number of components, which is it involves a breach of trust. It involves a breach of a promise. It could involve a breach of a bilateral agreement between countries. And when you breach those things, then what you leave is potentially allies behind. Shared objectives are abandoned when promises are breached. Vulnerable people like the publics in Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan are abandoned. And most importantly, I think when you breach your promise and you breach agreements and covenants, values are abandoned as well. Values of strengthening democracy, values of education, values of human rights. And I think the events in Afghanistan before 2021, but also in 2021 and since then, demonstrate, in our view, a fundamental betrayal of a people and of shared values and common objectives. And one reason we say that is that the US knew as early 2021 that unless measures were taken for the Afghan Air Force to refurbish its aging and overstretched fleet, it would ground to a halt by September of that year. The military knew it, decision makers in Washington knew it, because I sat in meetings in which National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked about trying to find ways in which they could make arrangements for Afghan Air Force to refurbish its fleet. They talked about arrangements to replace the army of contractors that were keeping everything in the air. They talked about providing assistance from outside of Afghanistan to suppress Taliban insurgency, if Taliban attacks if needed. They talked about providing continued military assistance hardware so that the Taliban knew that even though the US is withdrawing, that the support is still there. These are the words, paraphrased, of course, of Jake Sullivan in meetings that I attended. But by August of 2021, none of those things came through. There was no dependable mechanism for the Afghan Air Force to refurbish its fleet. There was no dependable mechanism in which the Afghan government continued to receive arms and ammunitions and supplies when the US left. And there was no mechanisms in place for the US to provide what they called over-the-horizon support, which is sending drones and other aircraft to support Afghan forces when needed. None of these things were in place. So that's one mechanism. The other is that we provide this in the chapter on betrayal. In the book Promises to Keep, which President Biden wrote before he became president, he recounts the story of going to a school in Kabul, and there is a girl who stands, quote, ramrod straight and says, "America cannot leave Afghanistan because I have to study and become a doctor." And Joe Biden writes in his book that I responded by saying, no, honey, America is not leaving. This is in his book, Promises to Keep. But in 2021, he recounts the same incident. And he says, and I told the girl that America has to leave. So when we talk about betrayal of vulnerable people and betrayal of values, I think those two quotes from about the same story from the American president several years apart, as a matter of public record, I think is a stark illustration of a change in position by the very highest levels of American decision-making that had real life consequences for people in Afghanistan.
So the Americans have been really involved with Afghanistan since the Soviets left, right? So that was in 1989. And then there was a transitional government, and then the Taliban seized Kabul in 1996. And then there was a period of unrest, is probably the understatement of the century. But in 2001, the Taliban had taken control of the country. And then 9/11 happened. And that's when then everybody turned against the Taliban. And Osama bin Laden was persecuted and eventually killed. And the Americans got really involved in Afghanistan. Was there ever a time when you and the Afghan people felt secure in the support of the Americans?
I think there was a time in late 2001, early 2002, up until maybe the 2006s, 2007s, and 2008s, when there was an atmosphere of a new beginning in Afghanistan, because the Taliban, for the first time in many, many years, had been relegated to the fringes. Their ability to destroy and to kill destroyed. And the warring factions of the Mujahideen who had been fighting over power had now agreed to a formula to share power in Kabul. The formula having been struck at a conference in Bonn, which paved the way for the Afghan constitution. So the political formula enshrined in the Afghan constitution enabled the various warring factions in Afghanistan to actually agree on a power sharing agreement. And the Afghan government that resulted from that was really that Afghan government that ended the wars of the 1990s after the Soviets left. So there was optimism, there was hope, and there was a sense that the Americans are staying here. And that sense was in some ways enabled by American promises that manifested themselves in the signing of documents like the bilateral security agreement, but also the strategic partnership agreement, which was signed in September of 2014. That timing is critical because the Americans actually started withdrawing from Afghanistan as early as 2011. When President Obama's surge in Afghanistan hit the timeline that he'd set for the surge, which is within so many months, we're going to start to draw down in Afghanistan. And so that drawing down started in 2011. And by 2014, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces had sort of taken over the complete charge and control of security across Afghanistan. Now, there was still some NATO forces, American forces that were doing what they called counterterrorism, but they were no longer doing what they called counterinsurgency, which meant that they were there to train, advise, and assist the Afghan forces, who were the main forces against the Taliban, but also fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting ISIS. The train, advise, assist forces of the US and NATO would do counterterrorism. So they would chase Al-Qaeda, they would chase similar international organizations, but they had ended their combat mission against the Taliban. So as early as 2014, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces were in complete control of Afghanistan with the assistance of American forces. And so when we talk about the decline and the fall of Afghanistan, the fall didn't just happen in a matter of weeks in July and August of 2021. There had been a period of years in which the ANDSF had defended the country very competently. But the triggers really went away. The Doha deal between the US and the Taliban triggered a cascade of events which had created a problem beyond what any military could have dealt with, because it changed the incentives of politicians and the economy. It changed the incentives of Afghanistan's partners and the incentives of the region. So no military could have really withstood that. But to come to your question, there was initial optimism. There was a lot of hope. People like me, I went back to the US after my undergraduate in 2012, hoping to be part of this movement and this new chapter in my country's history. I went to do my Fulbright and returned again in 2019, hoping to do the same thing. And I think there were other people who believed in that project of a Republican but also democratic Afghanistan who really did their best and worked very hard. And I think nobody worked harder and gave more sacrifices than the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces and their international partners who also fought and died in Afghanistan. But I think events really changed a lot of that. By later years, you saw people not just initially skeptical of American involvement, and later critical of them, and also cynical as well.
I can only imagine what that's like, Robert.
Would the fact that the Americans were negotiating in Doha, would that have been something that would have encouraged a climate either in America or elsewhere in Afghanistan that until those negotiations were fairly down the track, if not completed, that the bringing in of the extra supplies and equipment for the Air Force, such as you cited, all those things really needed to be put off. Were the two interrelated?
They were absolutely interrelated because while when the negotiations ended and a deal was struck and signed in February of 2020, the Americans actually stuck to the deadline of removing all troops from Afghanistan within 14 months from February of 2020. And so the clock was already ticking. And the pressure was that before the last American soldier had left, you needed to really put in place mechanisms by which the Afghan army could sustain itself. And so those mechanisms really never came to fruition.
But it wasn't just the military support. It was also America had also agreed initially to support economic and political support and all of that, and build up the economy again. But that didn't really happen, did it?
So the U.S. had promised to launch a very aggressive and vigorous regional diplomacy under Secretary Blinken that would involve neighboring countries, bring the clout of Turkey, and try to reach an agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And that really nothing came out of that initiative. And you have a quote, I think, in the book in chapter 8 from the former US ambassador in Kabul, who was at the epicenter of those efforts. And I think that nothing really came out of those diplomatic efforts. The US, so every 4 years, there was a major conference in which Afghanistan's international partners and Afghanistan would get together, and the Afghan government would present a vision for what they would do in the next 4 years in terms of governance, in terms of economy, in terms of human development, and the international partners would then pledge their support for that vision. And the 2020 conference was in Brussels. In years past, the US would have pledged for 4 years. That year, the US pledged for 1 year. And they said half of this pledge would go to the Afghan government now. The other half would be conditioned on the Afghan government making progress in the negotiations with the Taliban. Now, how could you make progress in the negotiations with the Taliban short of acquiescing and capitulating on everything to unlock this funding that had been promised? And so the US, under Secretary Pompeo, actually used its development assistance as a mechanism to force the hand of the Afghan government to capitulate in the negotiating table, because they were unsatisfied with the pace of peace talks. And I think both practice and literature show that peace talks often cannot be rushed in that way, because you need a reasoned and thought out and negotiated settlement. And that can take months, it can take years. Peace processes have taken years. And when you confine the two sides to 14 months between the signing of the deal and the last American soldiers leaving to reach an agreement, and you've already given away the leverage, which was the presence of American troops, the leverage against the Taliban, then it's impossible for the Afghan government to reach any meaningful deal in that 14 months.
The thing that I'm struggling with, I have to be honest, is Afghanistan is in such an in a situation where it shares borders with so many countries, with China, with Pakistan, with Iran. I'm going to look at my notes here: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, India, Russia, and Turkey are not far away. And it's got mineral resources that are estimated to be worth more than $1 trillion US. Now, it's a country that has been decimated by war for God knows how many decades now, and it's literally not thriving. And Americans have always been interested in promoting relationships with countries where there was an economic benefit. This sounds to me like it's a strategic as well as economic advantage to have good relationships with Afghanistan. And that was not going to happen under a Taliban rule, is it?
Absolutely not. I think the best of my understanding is that President Biden really wanted to be that US president who ended the, quote, forever war in Afghanistan. He also wanted to be the president who ended America's foreign entanglements in these increasingly marginal conflicts so that the US could focus exclusively on great power competition with China and Russia, primarily China, but also to work to strengthen democracies versus non-democratic countries around the world. And here was a democratic ally willing and able to work with you and be a partner. But that was, I think, not strong enough a reason for President Biden. But you have to understand that the forever war really was sort of, the forever war was sort of a political term coined by successive anti-war presidents and used in sort of debates. And it had sort of, it was divorced from the real costs of the war on the US in the last few years of their involvement. We talk about this in the book, but in the last several years before the US withdrawal, combat-related fatalities had really gone down to negligible in Afghanistan. And the amount of money required to sustain a marginal US military presence and sustain the ANDSF was in the single-digit billions of dollars, maybe double-digit billions of dollars, maybe 20 billion a year or so. Most of those expenses going to the US presence, and the Afghan defense and security forces only required about $5 to $6 billion a year in assistance to continue to sustain itself. And so in the final years, not only had the economic costs in the US gone down, but so had the human costs on the US gone down, because the US was no longer doing the fighting. It was the Afghan forces that were doing it. And yet, I think there were political impulses in the US that led to a different result.
Right. And that was the crazy president?
Well, the President Trump was the one who initiated the dialogue with the US. He was the one under whose watch the deal was signed. He didn't sign the deal with the Taliban. Ambassador Khalilzad, the special representative, did. But President Biden actually owned that deal, because when he became president in January of 2021, my apologies, I'm mixing my years. When President Biden became president in January 2021, he ordered a review of the US Taliban deal. And they concluded in that review that they will continue to embrace that deal. And by April of that year, they announced an intention to completely withdraw all of the US forces by August.
Okay. The one thing that I've been really wondering how this has impacted you, because you've grown up in a country that has basically been at war ever since, you know, you've been there. How has that impacted on your ability to, I don't know how to say this. I'm just saying this as I come, but you know, like there's always shifting states of security. You don't know who you can trust. It changes all the time, yet you maintained, you know, stability. You went studying in the US, you worked for the Security Council, you did all sorts of things. How has this impacted on you personally? I mean, you now live in Australia.
Well, the reason I went to the US for my undergraduate was because a university decided to give me a scholarship. So very, very generous of that university. Mm. I went on a Fulbright because the US State Department had one of the larger Fulbright programs in which they took 60 to 70 Afghans every year to the US on the Fulbright program. And so that generosity and that cultural exchange with Afghanistan was really decisive in, I think, creating a cadre of well-educated Afghans who would then work for the World Bank, for the Afghan government, for international development organizations, and were able to maintain a middle-class life in the middle of the chaos in Kabul. In fact, in many ways, the enduring legacy of Australian, American, and international presence in Afghanistan in the 2000s is really these people, the women who went and became soldiers, who became members of parliament, who became ministers, and other people who attained higher education, globally recognized education, and became a workforce that is globally competitive. And these people were contributing in Afghanistan, but now they're increasingly abroad and doing things elsewhere for other countries and other organizations. I'll tell you, there was a time when the Taliban were using these magnetic improvised explosive devices, which they would attach to vehicles moving on the road. And it had created a sense that you could never know whether the vehicle before you, behind you, to your right or to your left, had a magnetic bomb attached to it. So there was a constant sense of any of the vehicles that are parked and you're walking past it, that is driving and you're beside it, might explode, and that explosion might affect you. And so that sense of, and if you were at a hotel or at a restaurant, at a coffee shop, the sense that something might blow up outside or inside was ever present. So you had this hypervigilance, state of hypervigilance, and people continue to live, have coffee, fall in love, date, marry, raise a family in the middle of all of that. It was not ideal, but I think people managed despite all of that. And I remember when I went to Georgetown University for my Fulbright in 2017, I'm not a big gym goer, but I remember sitting on a bench in the gym at Georgetown University one day, looking around and thinking, how amazing is this? Because in this moment, in this gym, there is zero likelihood that there's going to be an explosion. So I can just tune out the world and do my little workout in this gym at this moment and feel completely safe. That moment I still remember because that was the moment of realization that you can sort of bring the hypervigilance down and just focus on being.
Yeah. So living in Australia?
I think it has been a wonderful experience being in Australia. I've made some fantastic friends. I have managed to not just maintain a 6-year long distance relationship with my then fiance, but we've also managed to get married. So we're living together in Melbourne now, which is, I think, a very fortunate thing for me to have happened, considering everything that happened in Afghanistan over the past few years. But the Australian society, organizations like the Australian Fulbright Alumni Association, have really welcomed us and taken us in. Me being a Fulbrighter from Afghanistan, I am now on the national committee of the Australian Fulbright Alumni Association. And I think that has given us a sense that even though we're new arrivals, even though the circumstances of our arrival in Australia were as traumatic and as difficult as could be imagined, we had a community here that actually welcomed us. And I think that has made the experience of living in Australia and sort of assimilating and integrating really a very smooth one. And I'm very grateful for that.
Well, we're very grateful that you're here and that you can lend us, your wisdom and your expertise. And I've got one final question. You said in your book, what the Taliban offered was a peace without welfare, a peace without liberty, and a peace, and there's a whole chapter on peace as well, which I would encourage everybody to read because it's so important, and a peace without the semblance of due process or justice. And now the Taliban is establishing diplomatic what are they called?
Relationships.
Diplomatic relationships, but also embassies or diplomatic stations in different countries all around the world. So while it's officially only been recognized by a handful of countries, it's starting to create all of these diplomatic relationships. And it's promising to be more inclusive, specifically around women and all sorts of things. Do you think that's a viable possibility?
What we wrote in the book about offering a peace without justice, a peace without due process under law, is what we're seeing in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime. Whereas no country has recognized or formally established diplomatic relationships with the Taliban this time. In the 1990s, 2 or 3 countries, Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi, had established relationships with them, recognized the Taliban. This time, 0 countries have established or recognized the Taliban. However, multiple countries have actually accepted a Taliban representative in the embassy of the former Afghan Republic. It's a sneaky way of saying that even though we're not extending formal diplomatic recognition, we are open to having diplomatic relationships. So several of these countries have their embassies in Kabul at this moment, and several of them are taking Taliban diplomats, China being one of them, Pakistan being another one, Iran being another one, Russia being a fourth. And I think what that does is it erodes this international norm, erodes the norm that when a democratically elected country, however challenged it was politically unpopular as it was domestically, is overthrown by a UN and US and EU sanctioned terrorist organization. And that terrorist organization then proceeds to establish policies of gender apartheid and completely eliminates women from public sphere, then it is okay to establish diplomatic ties short of formal recognition. And I think there's a danger of precedence here that erodes those fundamental values in a way that at this moment affects the people of Afghanistan deeply, but strategically it contributes to the erosion of these global values everywhere. And it's going to affect all of us, no matter where we are, no matter what kind of country we're living under.
Yeah. So you don't think that a more inclusive approach for the Taliban is actually on the cards?
The Taliban had shown early on when they were negotiating with the Afghan government that they were very scornful of anybody who had been in the government, because they saw them as sellouts to the values of their brand of Islam and all of that. And they were not just scornful, but they were violent towards them on the battlefield. And they have shown that now that they have come to power, not only do they continue to be scornful, but they also continue to be violent against opposition. And so when you talk about an inclusive Taliban government, you're really talking about, multiple factions of the Taliban being included in the government, but anybody who is not Taliban is really not included in any meaningful way. And you cannot be inclusive, even if you have everybody, but women are not allowed to be in the public sphere. And the Taliban are showing that they're going in the opposite direction on that particular issue. Inclusivity without women's inclusion is not inclusivity, it's gender apartheid.
We know that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese outlasted the Americans. And now we see that the Taliban outlasted the Americans. I'm wondering what you think kept the Taliban going and motivated them after they were defeated to rise up again and reach this point. Because they must have suffered terrible losses and so forth. So what was it about their organization that enabled them to do this?
There is no doubt that they suffered terrible losses over the past 20 years in the hands of the US, in the hands of NATO forces, in the hands of the Afghan Defense Forces. And I think a number of factors have been known to contribute towards the longevity of the Taliban. One is that the civilian casualties as a result of international coalition forces created resentments that in the long term fueled a semblance of allegiance to the Taliban. Other theories posit that people who were unsure and frustrated by the Afghan justice system would then turn to the Taliban justice system, which was so swift, if brutal. It was brutal, but it was swift. You didn't have to wait for 6 years for the outcome of a trial, and you didn't have to ostensibly bribe judges and lawyers along the way. And that created to a certain level of sort of pragmatic preference at some local level for the Taliban. But I think while those things are important, those things are not decisive for the victory of the Taliban. What really is decisive is the ability of the Taliban to draw from a bigger base of support, of fighters, and to sustain itself by accessing funds, personnel, but also a place to which they could retreat when there is pressure. And so there are tens of thousands of madrasas in Pakistan from which the Taliban could draw a seemingly infinite number of recruits, because these madrasas are not your regular math, science, and technology education systems. These are systems of education that indoctrinate on a very fundamentalist interpretation of religion. But also they could put, the leadership of the Taliban and their fighters could put their families and their own children and wives and parents and partners in the safety of Pakistan, and they could then go and pursue a career in bungee jumping terrorism. They could take risks knowing that their families would be safe elsewhere. So the cost of the violence that they perpetrated to their families was very minimal, and it divorced them from the personal cost of the violence that they would then put elsewhere. But on a strategic level, the support of the Pakistani government, specifically the intelligence and the military, cannot be underestimated. It cannot be overestimated. In 2014, US Defense Department officials were speaking to the US Senate. And 2014 was when the US was hemorrhaging soldiers at an alarming rate to improvised explosive devices. These are sort of homemade bombs on the roadside, and when an American Humvee was moving, they would explode, and that would result in significant casualties. The Defense Department officials were saying that 80% of the explosives used in these devices in Afghanistan traced their explosives precursor chemicals to 2 factories in Pakistan. And so when you can access a seemingly unlimited number of people to fight for you, but also procure a seemingly unlimited supply of explosives with which to sustain your movement, then it becomes very possible for you to sustain a 20-year war effort. Now, the US really put a lot of pressure on the Pakistanis to crack down on the supply of ammonium nitrate, which is really a fertilizer, but it's also used in explosive devices. To crack down on the supply of fertilizer to the Taliban. One of the things that the Americans did was to ask the Pakistani, because ammonium nitrate as produced is white. They said, put a dye on your ammonium nitrate so that when it comes across the border, the Afghan security forces can see that it's ammonium nitrate and completely seize it. The Pakistanis didn't so much as agree to dye their ammonium nitrate because who knows? And I think the failure to crack down on the Pakistani support, logistics, explosives, personnel, was something that really made it, I think, militarily impossible for the US and for others to crack down on, to completely decisively eliminate from the battlefield the Taliban presence, because they could replenish and rejuvenate very easily.
So the Taliban enjoyed basically a very wide range of fundamental Muslim support from governments right across Northern Asia, stretching into the Middle East by the sound of it. Saudi, Pakistan, I don't know, you would know better than I, but they actually sustained the Taliban. And during that whole 20, 30 years, and there was very little that the Americans could do about that. Yeah.
You see the failure, or at least the unwillingness of the Americans to really address the Pakistan problem in 2021, when the Taliban had signed an agreement with the US that the US would withdraw and the Taliban wouldn't attack withdrawing American forces, and that they would negotiate with the Afghan government for peace, but they would continue to fight with the Afghan government and not sign a ceasefire as the peace talks are going on. And so the Taliban were seemingly engaging in peace talks, but they were increasing their attacks on the Afghan government, security forces, civilians, and civil servants. And so when we multiple times talked with the Americans and said, you really need to press the Pakistanis to press the Taliban to stop their attacks, because if they're going to have peace talks with us, they cannot escalate militarily and also pretend to be talking peace with us. As we were pressing the Ambassador Khalilzad, the special representatives, to press the Pakistanis to push the Taliban to be more peaceful, he was out there in the press praising Pakistani cooperation in the peace deal. What he meant was that the Pakistanis had been very instrumental and critical in enabling the implementation of the US Taliban deal, which is the Americans will leave and the Taliban will not hit the Americans as they leave. The Pakistanis are cooperating very well on that front, but not on this other front of the Taliban's hugely dynamic and kinetic operations against the Afghan state and security forces. And I think that was really the Achilles heel that ultimately undid our collective efforts.
But what's the motivation for the Pakistanis and all the others that supported the Taliban?
That question has been sort of flogged like a dead horse over the past 20 years, but I think to put a reduced one sentence answer to that is territorial integrity. And the other phrase you see is strategic depth. The territorial integrity question is that Afghanistan does not recognize the border with Pakistan. Afghanistan claims that a significant chunk of what is now Pakistan belongs to them, which was given for a duration of 100 years to the then British India under the Durand Agreement that was brokered by Sir Mortimer Durand. And so the Pakistanis do not want a government in Afghanistan that could prosecute that claim, because that's antithetical to the territorial integrity of Pakistan. But also Pakistanis want to have a friendly regime on the other side of the border, so that should there be a military misadventure with India and the Indians press them, and Pakistan, as you know, is sort of thin but long, and India can really easily press them on the thin side of it, and they want to be able to go to sort of have the strategic depth to retreat and regroup and get back to India. So those two phrases have been used. I'm describing them in very reductive terms, but strategic depth and territorial integrity are really the reasons why the Pakistanis prefer and have assiduously worked to install a regime in Afghanistan that is broadly friendly to their interests, or at least incapable of prosecuting the territorial claim that Afghanistan has vis-a-vis Pakistan. So either you have a friendly regime in Afghanistan, or you have instability enough that those issues do not come to the fore.
So now Pakistan has to make sure that the Taliban doesn't become strong as a national force in Afghanistan. I'll have to keep on fomenting instability in Afghanistan if those reasons are their motivation for supporting the Taliban originally.
And I think what's very dangerous is that Pakistan itself is highly politically unstable at the moment.
Oh yeah.
And so that, I think, introduces an external element that's very unpredictable.
Yeah.
I'm very mindful of time. I just have one last thing. You left us at the beginning of our conversation. You left us your wonderful narration. You left us at the airport in Kabul. And you said you were going to pick that up later.
Well, I'm still at the airport, Angela, and after a series of events, my trusty Samsung Galaxy, the battery is dead. So I'm not able to establish contact with anybody, including people outside of Kabul who are trying to help me. But I am on a passenger plane that is stranded on the tarmac of the airport, and there's shooting going on outside. You could hear bullets shots being fired. And this plane has no crew, it has no pilot, it has no fuel. But all of the passenger seats are full and people are standing on the aisles packed like sardines. And this is August in Afghanistan, which is the hottest end of the summer. And so you have a fully packed plane with no lights on, no air conditioning going on, and there's no water for you to drink. And after a while, nobody wants to be that sucker who left the plane just before the crew came in and the plane took off. So everybody's sort of holding on to this hope, this vague hope, because there was really nothing evident that there would be a crew coming in, because the city is taken by the Taliban, the airport has been ransacked. And so I sat in this plane as long as I could. And at one point I realized that the country's vice president is sitting in a seat a few rows ahead of me. And eventually the vice president stood up and his coterie started to leave the plane. And I thought to myself, if this is the vice president and the vice president is leaving this plane, which is our only hope, which we could use to leave the country, he probably knows something that I don't know. Let me follow the vice president. So I followed the vice president, and turns out the vice president knew nothing more than I did. He was just suffocating and claustrophobic in this plane in the August heat. And so he deplaned and had his armored vehicles just parked under the belly of the plane. And he just wanted to have some space to breathe more easily. And I went to the second armored vehicle and I asked his chief of staff and I said, do you have a charger for the Samsung Galaxy phone? And as it happened, dumb luck, there was a charger cable in that vehicle and I used that to charge my phone. And we called the Americans, we called the Turks, we called NATO, we called anybody I had on my Rolodex to say, for goodness sake, the vice president's here, he's left alone, there's nobody to help him, come and rescue the vice president. And it took a few hours, but the CIA sent a team to sort of take the vice president and a number of others, including myself, from the Taliban-infested civilian side of the airport to the NATO-controlled side of the airport, in which, in the early morning of August 16, the evacuation of military flights were just beginning. So we got there. There was a Turkish Airlines flight specially chartered to evacuate Turkish citizens. And long story short, we were able to talk our way into boarding this Turkish Airlines flight. And that's how I landed in Turkey for a while before getting a visa to come to Australia.
Amazing.
But the moral of the story is that if half of your survival depends on dumb luck, the other half depends on a fully charged cell phone.
Well done.
Thank you so much, Shuja. That was first insight. Like as a historian, to have a witness of historical events is always a privilege. Thank you so much for your insights and for your passion for justice and for progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for your patience in listening to me over the past hour.
And are your books readily available, or your book?
The book is available for those who are screen readers. They're available for instant download on Amazon. For Kindle in the US, they're available through Oxford University Press. In the UK, they're available under Hearst Publishers. In Australia, they are available under New South Press, which is the distributing partner here in Australia.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you, everybody else who's listening and watching. We'll see you next time.